Welcome to the MindSea podcast series, Moving Digital Health. Our guest today is Dr. Raza Abidi, Professor of Computer Science, Professor of Medicine, and Director of Niche Research Group, Dalhousie University. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Abidi. Could you give us a brief overview of your background?
Sure. First of all, thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak at this particular forum. And my background is pretty straightforward, right? I'm a computer scientist by training, right? So my PhD was in computer science, specifically in neural networks. And then over the years, I migrated into health. So it has been almost a journey of close to 20 plus years where I have actually been working by using my machine learning and AI knowledge into applications in health.
Mm-hmm. And what drew you into working with health specifically?
Right, so that's an interesting story, right? I was in Malaysia from 95 to 2001, right? And I was working as a university professor in Malaysia. And round about, I would say 96 or 97, the Malaysian government had a mega project which was called the Multimedia Super Corridor, in which they were developing mega applications for different, I would say, disciplines such as health, education, manufacturing, and so forth. So my dean was selected to lead the health portfolio. Right? And we were in computer science, so we had no clue what health needs were and what were we required to do, right? So he then asked me and said, well, you work in AI, right? And you do a lot of decision support, which I see is applied in health. So why don't you come and join me? So I joined him in developing the Malaysian telemedicine blueprint. And then there were 4 authors, and I was one of them. And working with the Ministry of Health and a number of different clinicians, got the understanding of what health informatics was. So I'm not formally trained in health informatics, but over the years, right, I gathered what health informatics needs are and what the theoretical background is. So that's how I entered into health and health informatics, and the journey still continues.
I see. So you've been a researcher or a research professor for over 25 years. So you've seen that evolution of digital health for quite some time. What stands out to you as the impact or the large trends over that duration?
So that's an interesting question in terms of if we try to understand the evolution of digital health. I think the onset of digital health was a need to collect all patient information and then make it available at the point of care. Mm-hmm. And for a very long time, and even to this day, I think most of the digital health focus is on making the patient information available, right? If it is from collected from different I would say resources or different databases, such as the primary care. Then we look at the drug information systems, then we look at the PACS and so forth. So how do we bring it into a medical record, which is the electronic medical record? That has been the primary driver of digital health for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. Now, I think a lot of that has been achieved, right? So now the impact that we are seeing is, okay, what can we do with this information? What is it that are the services which are possible that can be built on this foundational element, which is what we call as the data layer. So I think now the exciting services are coming out, and we have, to a very large extent, done with the data collection, data sharing, and the data accumulation work that have been going on. Now, there are still challenges. I'm not going to say that we have solved all the problems, right? There's still a number of integration challenges. There are challenges within systems, within an institution. And then If you look at what Canada Health Infoway was trying to do a number of years ago, was how can the data be shared across different jurisdictions? So that again is a challenge. There are some solutions. But I think we have, from a mindset standpoint, we have moved from that data intensive digital health to more knowledge and services oriented data digital health.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Even though we're still not there in terms of collecting all the data and having all that the different care centers communicate with each other, we've still evolved to be able to to make use of that data in some really amazing ways. Specifically with AI and machine learning, which is some of your focus. Um, can you tell us about the your project using AI and machine learning for decision support?
So we have a number of projects, some completed and some ongoing, which are using artificial intelligence to a very large extent. And I just want to qualify over here, when I say the term artificial intelligence, I mean the both sides of artificial intelligence, which is the knowledge-based systems and the data-based systems. So when we talk about machine learning, it is largely the data-centric or the data-driven systems that we are talking about, right? So in that particular space, the decision support that is largely being pursued is around two different, I would say, problems. Number one is predictive modeling, and number two is patient stratification for risk assessment. So some of our projects that are in this particular space, I can give you an example of one in which we are looking at ICU intensive care unit, right, where patients are actually admitted, to looking at the prognosis of these patients over a period of time. Typically, when patients are admitted in an ICU, there is a risk score that is being calculated at the time of admission, but that risk score basically tells about the survivability of the patient as opposed to what should be the condition after a temporal period of, say 12 hours, 24 hours. So that score doesn't help the physicians determine what the care plan should be, what are the resources that they should be anticipating or proactively arranging for this particular patient. So we are looking at machine learning algorithms in order to develop these predictive models that will determine the condition of the patient at 24 hours, at 12 hours, 24 hours, 72 hours, and then 6 hours before discharge. So the point over here is not to just look at mortality, but how is the progression of this patient over time so that the physicians can determine a treatment plan accordingly. So that is one project that we are doing in the decision support sense. Another project which I think is extremely interesting is, and it is something that we don't think about, is around blood transfusion. So if we think about it, blood as a product cannot be purchased on the market. It is basically a donor has to provide blood. So blood is extremely, I would say, precious for it to be maintained. And in blood transfusion, typically what happens is that blood needs to be transferred from one center to another, depending on the needs, right? There is a request and the blood is being transferred over there, right? Secondly, there is a blood bank which is storing these blood units, and there needs to be an inventory count of how much blood they have of each type, and also what are their expiries. So we are using artificial intelligence in this particular case to detect that whether a blood unit is potentially heading for what we call as a discard. Okay. And if we can figure out that this blood unit is heading for a discard, then it is quite possible that the blood transfusion staff can pick up that blood unit and use it in a much more appropriate way and save that particular blood unit. So we are able to actually predict that a blood unit is going for a discard at least 3 steps before it is actually going to go for a wastage or a discard. So that is another completely different approach where we use Markov models to predict wastage ahead of time. So these are one. Then we are looking at a completely different one where there is a face recognition that is being used for detecting a disease called acromegaly. So the acromegaly is a thyroid-related disease, a hormone disease, which basically affects the shape of facial features. But this distortion of the features happens over a long time, so people don't necessarily notice it. It's not a day-to-day thing, right? It may happen over years, right? And sometimes people may think that it is because of aging or some other factor, so they don't really catch it, right? And when you catch acromegaly, it is rather too late. So what we are doing is that we are using facial recognition technologies, which is supported by machine learning, whereby we have developed an app where the individual are basically given the app and they take a picture of their face, right? And it is a dedicated picture, and it goes through a facial recognition exercise in which we basically determine that whether this individual's current picture has any distortions from their last year's picture or whatever the previous one was.
Right.
And in that way, we are able to determine that whether there is any signs of acromegaly or not, right? So this is going to be a long-term process. Individuals take their pictures maybe 6 months every year, and we are able to compare it with the cohort of pictures we have using machine learning algorithms and see whether there is a discernible distortion in their facial features.
Yeah, I see that as something that even a device manufacturer like, Apple or Samsung could have built into the
Very
camera.
true.
So that because, over the years, you're taking so many, pictures of not only yourself, but of family members.
Exactly.
And it could say, just like it does, with the Apple Watch, hey, we're seeing something, we're detecting, a possible risk here. You should go, talk to your physician. So it's not diagnosing, but it's just suggesting that there might be a problem and that you should talk to a doctor to investigate.
Exactly right. I think it's basically flagging that there is a potential, right, onset of a disease, right? And the magic over here is what is considered distortion.
Yes.
Right. So that's where our algorithms come in. Right. So aging is taken into account, right? Some predisposed conditions of an individual is taken into account. And then we figure out that there is some discernible distortion in somebody's facial features. So there are many things like this, right? We have a decision support system that is looking into how groundwater, or rather well water, right, which typically in Nova Scotia is used a lot in rural communities, right, is affected by environmental factors, especially arsenic, right? And arsenic is a carcinogenic which leads to a number of different cancers, specifically prostate cancer, breast cancer, and so forth, right? So we are looking at the disposition of arsenic in well water leading to cancers. And the way we are doing it is a very unique way of doing it. Is there is Atlantic Path is a project. It's a pan-Canadian project, which is looking over a number of at least 20 to 30 years, follow up with patients as they move through their life and they monitor different things. So we are taking toenails, right, as the biomarker.
Oh, really?
Yes, because toenails actually they grow slowly and they cannot be contaminated, right? If you take fingernails, right, then they can be contaminated with soap, soil, right, maybe nail polish and so forth. So you lose that, the intensity of biomarker for arsenic over there. So we look at toenails. They are then analyzed by toxicological various series of devices, and then the data comes to us, and we are using machine learning to first of all detect that whether this person has a propensity towards towards cancer, and then the next thing that we are looking at is that what kind of cancer it would be.
Okay.
So there are three kinds of cancers that we are looking at right now. We are looking at prostate cancer, breast cancer, and melanoma.
Mm-hmm. And is there an existing connection between arsenic and those cancers already? Or?
Yes, it's a very profound connection has already been noted, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other studies, and these are all epidemiological studies, that if the concentration of arsenic is of a certain amount, right, then it is leading to cancers of these kinds.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of going after individuals, if we can figure out at an environmental level, because that water would be used for the whole population.
Yes. And so what are the actions we can take? And I guess
exactly.
How can we remove the arsenic from
this is then going to be and actually it is a population health project.
Mm-hmm.
So once it has been detected that in this community or in this geographical region, we have noted that the concentration of arsenic is of a level that it is of concern, right? And these are the types of cancers that we are noting over here. Then the population health or a public health advisory and educational programs, and even risk assessment tools are to be developed so that people can actually monitor the level of arsenic, and at the same time, that is it of a level that they should be concerned about the onset of cancers.
Yeah. All of these projects sound amazing, because you just think of how much of an impact that can have on a population. Once these connections are identified, and then we can take action to solve the problem. It can really have a big impact. And looking at the blood management solution, like you said, it's so precious that even a small improvement in the efficiency of utilization of the existing blood can have a big impact for the people that need it.
Exactly, and I think that these are all very impactful, and I would say directly connecting with the healthcare system efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think that's what the target is, that how can we actually use decision support to impact the operationalization of healthcare services.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the system in the ICU to predict outcomes there, what are the data points that are feeding?
That's a very good question, because I didn't allude to it, but this is a very interesting exercise that we are doing. So we are looking at three different data sources, right, which are then integrated into one data point, or what we call as a vector, which is going to be used to train the models, right? So first of all, of course, there is data that is coming from critical care, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the monitors that are in an ICU, right? Of course, we will be sampling it at a rate that becomes feasible. So that is one thing. Then ICU patients actually are being investigated for various blood markers on a very routine basis. So the second data that we are getting is pathology data, right? And the third data that we are getting is radiological imaging. So we would be combining radiological imaging, pathology data, largely it is blood works, right, and the critical care data into one data point, and that would be used to train the model. So we are not just looking at the critical care or the pathology, which is typically how some people would be doing it, but this is a much more integrative exercise for decision support that we are taking.
Mm-hmm. And at the end, I guess the goal is to help physicians better prioritize patients
Exactly. The main, yes,
as their needs change.
exactly. So what we really want is to proactively determine like what is the course of the condition or the disease for each patient. So we are predicting 12 hours ahead, right? So it gives enough time for the ICU physicians to determine what would be the most optimal treatment plan, right? And let's suppose that after 12 hours, it is indicated that this person would need incubation or this person would need a surgical procedure. Then instead of making a decision and then rushing around to figure out that whether these resources are available, right? We would then be able to actually have these resources available at the time of need because we would have some lead time to prepare for any surgical procedure or incubation or any other activity that is resource intensive.
Mm-hmm. So with all of these projects, obviously there's multiple stakeholders involved from the health authorities and clinicians and government. Um, do you find it's difficult to get everyone on board or on the same page to move these types of projects forward?
It is challenging to begin with, right? But I think if all of us have the same objective, right, then people come together quite quickly, right? So if the project is initiated by our colleagues in medicine or the physicians, right, obviously they have noted a particular need, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are looking for a solution, right? Of course, they are not as technically savvy to figure out what that solution is, right? So that's why we would be working in collaboration with them and we would be saying, okay, if you can explain what the problem is, right, then we would help you develop a solution. You would have to find us the resources. Typically, the resources for a machine learning kind of a project would be what is the data needed and how can we actually get it. So they would help us in that, right? For another kind of decision support, which is using knowledge-based technologies such as clinical guidelines or clinical workflows, then again, we would be asking them, can you please interpret certain terminological, conceptual components of these guidelines? So there is challenge in the beginning, right, where we need to understand each other's way of working. But I think if there is a common objective, the teams gel very, very quickly, right? Now, there is a requirement over here that is important for, for maintaining, I would say, boundaries around each other's work, right? So the technology component largely relates to what is the model building, right? How would we be doing it? That remains our domain, right? We would then give it to them for validation, right? And they would validate it and then give it back. So it goes back and forth, right? We won't tell them how they do their thing and they won't be telling us how to do it, right? If we are doing the things in the right way. Secondly, terminology. Terminology is very, very important. Lexicons, right?
Yeah.
Do I understand what are the clinical variables that they are giving us? What do they mean? What do their measurements mean? Right? What are their ranges? Right? So we would understand that. And likewise, the clinicians also make a significant effort in understanding how we explain our working of the models. So if we are giving an outcome in terms of a certain diagram, we would be expecting them to understand how this diagram actually works. And they make an effort to understand it. If we are showing results which have certain metrics of performance, right, then they would be understanding, okay, so this is a better result. This is a better model compared to the other one. So I think it goes as a learning exercise as well. But like I said, if we are all working towards a common goal, we get together very nicely.
For sure. So you recently hosted the Artificial Intelligence in
Hmm.
Medicine conference, and I went to some of the sessions. And one of the topics that I know you're working on as well is explainable AI. And I think that connects to what you're talking about of making sure that clinicians can understand the tools that are being built. Maybe could you talk about explainable AI in a little
Sure.
bit more
So,
detail?
so I'll rewind a little bit over here. Right? Before machine learning became so popular, right, decision support systems and clinical decision support systems were still being developed using knowledge-driven technologies. Right,
Mhm.
and these would be expert systems. They would be having rules. Right, we would be using ontologies as a knowledge model. Right? Now, for these knowledge-based systems, they are intrinsically explainable, right? Because they are using natural language in terms of the description of the logic and the rules. So when an outcome is determined by a decision support system, it's pretty straightforward to ask it, okay, what was the reason for this particular outcome? And a knowledge-based system, we call it a justification trace or a reasoning trace, would very simply say rule number 1 was used, rule number 5 was used, and rule number 10 was used. You can
Mhm.
go and read rule number 1, rule number 5, and rule number 10 and say, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. These are the
Yep.
rules that would conclude this particular outcome. So there was no issue around interpretation of the outcome. Now, when we started using machine learning models, right, in the early days, they are basically black box models, right? You push the data from the input and you get an output, and in between something happens. Right? That what something happens is a point of contention. Right?
Mhm.
Especially in medicine, where decisions are to be made which are affecting lives. Clinicians were always wary that I think I can, and they would say, I think I can agree with the outcome, but I would really want to know what were the reasons behind this outcome. And machine learning could not give a suitable answer. They would simply say that, well, the model learned the data and it is giving you a certain outcome.
Yeah.
So that is where the explainable AI actually came in, which was basically trying to open this black box and trying to decipher the logic that a model actually uses in order to derive this particular outcome. Right? Now, there are a number of techniques that are being developed. Right? The most simplest technique is what we call as feature importance. Right.
Mhm.
So what the explainable AI algorithm would simply do is that for a certain outcome that it has generated, it would turn around and tell the user that these were the most important attributes from your data. So if your data had maybe 50 different variables or attributes in it, it would say, well, the most important one was X, the next one was Y. So the physicians can actually get a sense of, okay, so these were the critical attributes that were used in the outcome. And if they are the critical ones, they would have a degree of confidence. But if they see something funny in those attributes, they say, well, why are you using this in the decision? Then they would have a suspicion about the output. So
Mhm.
that is the most simplistic way of looking at explainable AI, which is feature sensitivity analysis of feature importance. Now we are moving, and this is where our research comes in, is that we are moving beyond that, right? Because that is basically telling us which features were used and which were supposedly important in the outcome, right? But it is not explaining the relationship between the features, and
Mhm.
it's also not explaining the underlying conceptual associations between those features and the outcome. Why is it that if this feature, right, let us suppose, right, the glucose level is high, why is it affecting the outcome? That why is not there. It is just saying that this glucose level was high. Right now, you figure out yourself. If it is high, then it means this. But we are looking at explaining the why, right? And in order to explaining the why, right, you now need to have domain knowledge. How does this actually function as a biological system? Right? So we are basically creating knowledge graphs, and these are for specialized domains. The one that we are currently working on is largely into chronic kidney diseases. So we basically develop a knowledge graph or a knowledge model that encapsulate knowledge about what is chronic kidney disease, what are the risk factors for it, what is the genetic information right to that, or the genomics that is contributing to it, what are the comorbidities, what treatments would actually affect it, right? What are the reasons for certain conditions? So we capture all of that in a knowledge graph. And then when we look at the model, we can now explain, right, using that knowledge, right, in a very narrative form, that because this was very high and this has an association, or this concept causes or exacerbates the condition, that is why you are seeing this particular outcome. We can now give a narrative text of why a particular outcome is being given in a language that is related to the problem domain, in which case ours is chronic kidney diseases.
And of course, this helps to build trust.
Exactly. It is all about trust. If the clinician sees that our explanation is close enough to what they have been trained and what they have experienced, right, then they would take it. Otherwise, they would always have a suspicious eye towards what the outcome is. So that is what the entire reason for Explainable AI is to build trust. And once we build the trust, then the uptake of that decision model would actually be high. Otherwise, it would be used on and off, right? And there would always be, can I have a second opinion, right?
Yes, of course. And if it's spitting out a recommendation, and the specialist is just ignoring it because he's thinking, or they are thinking, oh, last time it didn't make any sense, so I'm just gonna trust my gut because I'm the expert, and that black box machine doesn't know what it's doing. So then once that trust is lost, then it's not helping patients, not helping anything.
And you see, once that trust is lost, it has an effect that we don't really understand. Machine learning models are basically pattern recognition models, right? They recognize inherent patterns in the data and use that information to regress towards an outcome, right? Now, it is quite likely that the outcome which they are predicting, right, is for a rare condition, and they have picked it up. Right? The model has picked it up, right? But the explanation was not sufficiently rich enough or not explicit enough to convince the physician that this is, right, a viable and this should be treated as a legit outcome. Because it was rare, the physician also does not have enough exposure to this. So the physician might consider this as an incorrect outcome and let it go. And that is a missed opportunity to pick up something that was of a rare nature, for which the physician did not have enough exposure, but the model picked it up. So if my explanation was a good one, right, the physician can put 2 and 2 together and say, oh, that's an interesting finding. I didn't think of it in this way, but the explanation actually makes a lot of sense, right? So let me consider this line of reasoning as well.
And then the usefulness of the AI can depend on the clinician that's using it as well. If the AI is giving you a response, and that lines up with a specialist that has many years of experience in their field, and they can say, okay, yep, that makes sense. if the AI is giving a recommendation to, let's say this is a fairly junior clinician, they're in a remote place where they don't have access to that specialist, then it could possibly have a much bigger impact on in those types of situations.
Exactly. And even if you don't want to use it for clinical use, right, a decision support system, right, taking your example of working with junior clinicians or clinicians who don't have access to senior, more experienced colleagues, right, such a decision support system, and we have also asked for it and might go and do a project, can be used as an educational device.
Right.
Right, in which you basically have trained the model, right, using real data, but then we would be using, right, a number of simulated patient cases, right, and those simulated patient cases can actually be derived by experts, right,
Mm-hmm.
and then use the decision support model, right, to run on those simulated cases, right, which may cover a wide variety of patient scenarios, and the outcomes could actually be a learning point for the junior physicians that, okay, this was the clinical scenario, right, and this is the outcome. So now let us look at what is the reason for this outcome, so that then the explanation that we are providing is
Mm-hmm.
basically educational content.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity for them to basically learn certain clinical scenarios that they may not necessarily be exposed to because of, right, or may not have been given the opportunity to comment on because there were more senior people in that institution, right? So now they have this opportunity to use this as an educational device and see what could be a potential recommendation for a certain clinical condition.
Right. Yeah. So as a learning tool, it can have a big impact as well.
Exactly, it can be, right? So you don't use it for clinical purposes, but use it as an educational tool because the model has encapsulated the knowledge about the discipline, about that particular problem. So how do you actually explicate that knowledge, right? You start giving more complex cases, unusual cases, rare cases, right? And let's see what the model actually comes out with,
Mm-hmm.
and use that explanation as the learning content.
So one of the topics at the conference was the quality of the data as well. So, the output of the AI is only as good as the data that is being put into it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the process of taking a raw data source and preparing it to use with an algorithm.
So data quality is definitely an issue, right? But prior to injecting data into a machine learning model, there is a whole process of data science and data pre-processing, right,
Mm-hmm.
which involves looking at missingness of the data, outliers in the data, right, misinterpretations of the variables that are out there. Right? So there is a process that can actually be incorporated prior to preparing the machine learning model. Right? Now, this does not account for data collection errors.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if there are measurement errors, if the device that was, let's suppose, taking your blood pressure has a problem, right? I was at a clinician's office the other day, and the clinician was telling me that our blood pressure machine, right, on the systolic is 15 points high.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I said, "Was you still using it?" I said, "Yeah, I know that it's 15 points high." Right. Okay, so I do the subtraction and now I know what the real value is. Now, if that device is being used as your data collection, then obviously there is a problem. So measurements of the data, right, coming from a device or coming from an observation is something that AI obviously cannot handle it, right? At the
Mm-hmm.
onset, I'll tell you how we can overcome that particular problem, right? The second thing is the use of that data, right? Sometimes we don't realize that more data is not necessarily what you are looking for. For example, right, if I take a look at my ICU project, right, the ICU project, right, has monitors connected to the patient,
Mhm.
and they are giving real-time readings, right?
Yeah.
Now, do I need real-time readings? Probably not, right? Because the reading of my temperature didn't change in 1 second.
Right.
Right? So if I take it as sampling of 1 second, I'm basically creating a lot of data which is not changing over time, right? And it is simply, right, adding more complexity to my data later on, right? So a better sampling rate, maybe picking up that data every 10 minutes would have been a better choice as opposed to collecting data on a 1 second sampling rate. So sometimes what we do is that we inadvertently, right, misuse the data, right? For example, right, data coming from a survey,
Yes.
right? Now, is that a good data source? Right? Probably not, right? Because it is objectively weak, right?
Mhm.
There's
And
no measurement criteria over there, right? There's a Likert scale. How are you feeling today? Right. Well, if I woke up early, right, I will be saying I feel horrible. If I had a good night's sleep, right, then I'll say I was feeling quite good. So the objectivity is not there, and those kind of measurements, right? I think the problem largely is with the measurements.
yes.
Right. Now, when we bring it into our model and in the pre-processing stage, right, we can look at what are the ranges of the data that is coming in, and they could be normalized, right, if they are out of range, to a range that can be actually assumed to be the right one. So there are error correction mechanisms, right? But we don't want to do that. Secondly, missingness. Clinicians don't like imputation, right? In other areas, we would impute the data. So if there's missing values, we'll take a look at the variables' other values, and we can impute that this could be potential value for it.
Yeah, making some assumptions.
Exactly, right. And there are some good imputation algorithms that would do that, and they give you realistic values. But we have to report that this was not the real data, it has imputed values in it.
Mm-hmm.
So the point is that I usually consider data collection as the weak link in the whole process. How was this data
Yeah.
actually collected, right? As opposed to what the models or what the algorithms are capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. And this is where the bias comes in too,
Exactly.
right?
All of those things come over there, right? Now, sometimes, right, bias is there, right? But it is not introduced intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt any researcher or any clinician would introduce bias intentionally, right? There would be very few cases for it, right? But if the thought process is not there, right? If then it would creep in,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if it creeps in, then figuring it out, right? That whether this was intentional or whether it was inadvertently brought in, right? And secondly, from a data standpoint, is this bias going to affect the performance of the model or not? That is a different question.
Yeah.
Versus looking at the from a from an ethical standpoint, that whether this bias is there in the data or not. So they're two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
From an ethical standpoint, if a certain population is not well represented, right, then it is a bias towards one population versus another.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But the question is that if I take that data and put it into a machine learning model, does the model feel that there is a bias over there, or the model has the capacity to overcome the shortness in one population, and it can do it,
Mm-hmm.
and will still perform fine. So I think that the biases comes at two different levels, right? Which we need to understand: is it an ethical bias, or it is a bias that would affect the performance of the model?
Right, because with some data, let's say it was a gender bias, male versus female, and there was, it was skewed towards one of in the data set. It doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome of the algorithm is not going to apply, to the other gender just because it was skewed one way. It might be just as good, but we don't know. It might also have a big effect depending on those type of things. So I think it's a really good point to need to filter for the impact of a biased data set.
Yeah, but you see, when data is being collected, if there is a population of 2,000 patients, right, and 40% of them is of one gender and 60% of them is another gender, right, then there is a 20% gap between the two, right? That cannot be overcome because your population was 2,000 patients.
Yes.
Now the question comes, is this difference, right, in the population size of a significant, right, influence on the outcome, right? And that's a different question, right? But making it 50-50, right, sometimes is just not possible.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have a data set, right, in which there are certain conditions that are so rare, right, that they would always be rare.
Of course, yeah.
Right, they would always have a very small proportion in the data. Right, now, what can we do about it? That's a completely different set of modeling, right? But the point being is that there was no intentional bias. It is just the nature of the problem that you are dealing with, that there are certain outcomes which are rarer than the others.
Mm-hmm. So you worked and implemented many real life digital health solutions. Is there a mindset or kind of a philosophy or approach you take to these types of projects when you start? Like, is there a specific vision for what it's going to be, or do you start just say, hey, here's a problem and we're going to solve it and see where it goes?
I think there are two kinds of projects. One is problem solving, right? Hey, this is an interesting problem, like you just said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I can use our algorithms or our AI expertise to solving it, right, then it becomes a proof of concept, right? It basically is a demonstrator project. The other kind of projects is, no, we need a real application, right? This is an intervention that has to be implemented in the healthcare system. So I think the approach is completely different for both of them, right? The first one is a very exploratory approach in which we are simply saying, this is a problem, let us explore different solutions, and then we can compare what actually is the most efficient or the most optimal solution. Right? The second one is a much more directed approach over here, in which we would be taking really a software engineering methodology, right, and saying that, okay, we need to develop an application, right? So these are the processes, these are the steps that we would have to undertake, because this is an application, right? Then it has to have a very viable and trustworthy validation step, right? Who is going to validate it? Is it a clinical trial that is going to validate it? Or is it a consensus among experts that is going to validate it? Then it follows an implementation science exercise, that how would it be implemented within the clinical workflows of the institution, of that particular department, or of that set of physicians who are going to use it. So I think it's a very targeted, goal-oriented approach that is being taken in those projects which are to be treated as a point of care or a point of need intervention. And the goal is set up front. This is what we are looking for, right? And then you basically see a methodology that would work to achieve that goal.
Okay. And what are some of the main barriers that you encounter with some of these projects? And do things ever just get stalled and not find a way forward?
Well, the main barrier is, I think, the initial onboarding is a barrier where people do not understand, right, that what is this particular methodology or the methods that are going to be used. And on our side, we are unable to understand what the physicians are trying to achieve by this particular project or understanding of the data. So those are initial onboarding problems that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the midst of the project, I think the main barriers are, do we have a right methodology for the evaluation of our outcomes? Right? Because development is not the issue, but once we develop it, looking at its clinical efficacy, looking at its clinical correctness, looking at its clinical utility, looking at its clinical usability, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are all evaluation points that need certain standards, right? That need certain metrics, and it needs certain expertise in order for it to be moving forward towards a product that can be rolled out. And I think the barrier is at that particular point. Do we have the experts who can validate it? Right?
Right.
Do we have the test data that can actually be used to validate it? Do we have the time and the resources to run it as a 1-year pilot study or a 6-month pilot study? How would we actually do it? Do we have the right metrics to evaluate it? And even if we do all of that, right, are we able to establish enough reliability and trust in this application for it to be put in clinical use? So I think those questions towards the end start rearing their head, and how do we navigate through them becomes the challenge.
Mm-hmm. And how about taking a solution that has been validated in one context? Let's say it's at one hospital or one clinic, and say, okay, this works. We know it's good. The scientific data is there, and how to roll that out and then implement it at a larger scale.
So that is a scalability question, right? That whether the solution is scalable to another health environment or institution, right? Now, it is, at least your starting point is different over here, because the product or the model, whether it's a decision support model, it has already been developed. Right. Now it is, how do we actually operationalize it into the clinical workflows of that institution? So it becomes a more of an implementation exercise as opposed to the model building or the development of the project from scratch. And most of these applications, the ones that we develop, right, they are agnostic to site and clinical, I would say, workflows. So they do have the ability that if I'm moving it to another clinical workflow, then changing a set of parameters actually allows us, right, to incorporate this application into a different clinical workflow. So that is always a possibility, right? Now, in a different environment, you're working with different people. It requires a different set of training. It requires a different set of change management, a different set of knowledge translation. But I think there is an ability, more or less, for moving your application from one environment to another one, right, through developing applications that are agnostic to a specific ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And I know that the research and work you're doing at Dalhousie is very cutting edge. But are there other countries or institutions that you look to that you say, hey, they're really leading the technology here. They're doing it right, and we can learn from them?
I think, and I'll say this because I say this a lot in the public as well, right? Europe is way ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and when I say us, I mean North America. I don't mean just Canada, right? So in terms of digital health innovation and digital health adoption, Europe has always been ahead of us. Maybe it is because of the size of the countries or the resources that they were able to put into the healthcare system, right? But there is a natural tendency, right, for innovation, right, and adoption, right? And they have pursued complex problems. So when we were busy over here in Canada, right, figuring out that what our electronic medical record should look like and how would it be connected with different departments within an institution, they had already sorted it out, right? And they were now building decision support systems on those electronic medical records. They were building risk assessment tools on those ones, right? They were looking into complex problems that were around spatiotemporal analysis of the data, right? They were looking into comorbidities. They were looking into risk factor assessments. So I think they have always been ahead. One example is that this conference, which I just hosted, is traditionally a European conference. And I think this is the second time it was brought into North America. The first 2020, it was brought to US, and then I brought it to Canada. So it clearly shows that there is a community in Europe that is solving hard problems in this area, right? And we do look at certain centers for very specialized digital health or even AI and health research in Europe.
And any specific, universities that you've collaborated with or on other projects?
Oh, yes, we collaborated with universities in Italy. We have collaborated with universities in Spain. Right. There have been collaborations with universities in the UK. So they're all doing good work, right? Each one of them have their own specialization, or because each university has a group, just like I have a group, right? And we are focusing on certain areas. So yes, we do have these collaborations, sharing of information. Just today, I was asked that, can you help us solve a problem in knowledge graphs, right? Because this is where we are stuck. Now we'll look into it and then help them with that. And where does it lead? I think we'll have to figure it out. So I think there are collaborations across the different countries and between us and European partners, which leads to interesting solutions because there are two sides of research. One is fundamental research, and one is applied research. And it is the fundamental research that is supported by these collaborations, because that's where we're asking the hard questions.
Right. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the history of digital health, what you're working on right now. Now looking ahead into your crystal ball over the next couple of years, what are the innovations you're excited about or hoping to see?
So I don't have that particular crystal ball, but I'm just looking at where the trends are, right? I think one cannot discount the utility and applicability of artificial intelligence in health, right? It is coming from all sides, right? Whether you're looking at as decision support models such as predictive analytics, right? Or you're even looking at surgical robots. At the end of the day, behind it, there is a strong component of artificial intelligence. But what I really feel is that the way things are moving, right? There is a shift towards applications that are in the hands of patients. Right, and giving them the resources and the ability to self-manage their condition. And this is largely in the realm of what we call as e-therapeutics. Now, it doesn't mean that all the data is going to them, but there are applications that are coming. And this is basically a trend, right, that moving healthcare from a tertiary center further towards primary care. That was happening 20 years ago and it's still on. But from the primary care, even further down the road to the principal party, i.e. the patient or the individual themselves. So I think that is a strong, I would say, trend that is coming up, right? It then brings into play an area that is growing very, very rapidly, and that is virtual care, remote monitoring of individuals. What we saw during the pandemic was regarded as virtual care, which was basically telehealthcare, right? Physicians were contacting their patients by phone or by Zoom and so forth, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about using the lifestyle data that individuals may have, right? And doing remote monitoring of their functional status, doing remote monitoring of their cognitive abilities, looking at whether they are getting fragile over a period of time, right, or not, right? These are, frailty is another thing that is being looked into. So lifetime monitoring of individuals, right, to determine that what health needs they may have in the future, what health education can be provided to them, how can they be supported to self-manage their condition while staying at their home. And I think you have also seen this trend over here that retirement homes and then growing older at home is now becoming the trend. Well, if that is the case, then we need some monitoring, some remote monitoring that helps them to provide just-in-time information and just-in-time health therapeutics to help them. So I think that is a big area that is coming up. Genomics and working towards precision medicine, drug discovery. I think that is now possible given the amount of data that we have collected and our ability to sift through it. Precision medicine is really coming very, very strong. Right? And I think there are some very unique opportunities for mental health therapeutics now. Right? And unique ways of figuring out that whether a person has a need for a mental health therapy or not. So it's not just the didactic interviewing between an individual and a psychiatrist. It is not that anymore, but rather looking at how they are functioning, how their mood is, how they are interacting in the community, the social connections, and so forth, right? It is now developing a picture, a mental health picture of an individual that can then be used as a precursor to whether the person needs mental health therapy or not, and what kind of therapy, or whether the person is depressed or not, or there's a sense of anxiety in this individual or not. So I think those non-traditional ways of figuring it out is what the most exciting element is in terms of mental health. So I think these are some of the things that are happening. I don't see that there is a lot of innovation or energy or into the traditional digital health, which was around electronic medical records or care coordination or the PACS and things like that. I think we have enough of that to work forward into services that are reaching out to individuals.
Yeah, at MindSea, we're very excited about the potential of digital therapeutics as well, and building those tools that empower patients to take better care of themselves in between the visits with the doctor, because it's about that 24/7 care, all the actions they can take to better their health in between the consultations. Look, I really appreciate you taking the time. You have a lot of wisdom to share, and I've certainly learned a lot in the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Abidi. And thanks for everyone for listening as well. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the MindSea newsletter to be notified of future episodes.